I was stationed in Germany from 1983 to 1986. Kathy and I lived in a small farming village about 35 miles north of Frankfurt. It's called the Dorf Gühl. Behind our house there was a large field that lay fallow the whole 3 years that we were there. And I remember that one morning I went and I opened the blinds on the back window of one of the rooms and was quite surprised to see there was a flock of sheep all over our backyard and extending into that large field. Some of them were grazing right up next to the house. I didn't particularly care that they were doing that, but it was certainly an interesting sight. And there was a shepherd there. He was a German shepherd. Anyway, he was all decked out in his German style clothing, kind of Bavarian style, which was pretty interesting to be north of Frankfurt, but he was smoking his pipe and had his staff and was just watching the sheep. And after several minutes, he walked over to the right side of the flock from right to where I was, and he turned around and he spoke to the sheep, and I couldn't really hear what he said, but I saw him speaking. And immediately all the sheep turned and they started walking toward him. And the sheep dog that he had came up behind the rear of the sheep and made sure that, they kind of stayed in formation. Now, when Jesus was speaking of shepherding in the passage in John and other times he spoke of it, his hearers would have understood all the images of shepherding in ancient Judea. They would have understood it far better than we do. Not many of us have any familiarity with shepherding. For example, William Barclay explained that in Jesus' day, when a shepherd was out with his sheep overnight, he would erect a simple pen. Usually it could just be one single strand of rope in a large circle that the sheep had been raised from time of birth not to cross that rope. And there would be a gap where the two ropes started to come back together. He put the sheep inside the rope, and then he would spend the night by lying in the gap. He was literally the gate to get into the sheep pen. Now, obviously, anyone having legitimate business would come to the shepherd lying at the gate, and anyone who went across that rope was up to no good. But Jesus is speaking figuratively, spiritually, of course, and his words must have called to mind some of the Jewish scriptures in which God described himself as the shepherd of the people Israel and the people as his flock. In Ezekiel 34, for example, the prophet portrays most kings of Israel as bad shepherds who, through misrule and corrupt religious practices, placed the flock, the people of Israel, in danger, both physical danger and spiritual danger. And Ezekiel counters that God alone is the good shepherd and who will rescue the sheep and place them in, quote, in care of my servant David, meaning a monarchy restored to the righteousness of King David. But in Jesus' day, the kingdom of Israel was gone forever. Judea was a Roman province occupied by Roman soldiers and government officials. It's not likely that Jesus was referring to them as the thieves and bandits. The prophetic history of that term had referred to corrupt Jewish or children of Israel persons in authority, not to foreigners. Nor would he probably have meant that the long line of Jewish Hebrew prophets who came before him were bad men, because Jesus always expressed admiration for Moses and his successors. Jesus' teaching then operates on a religious level, and really probably about three of them. Temporally, New Testament scholars agree that Jesus was directly referring to the Pharisees of his day as the thieves and the bandits. John's gospel is quite unkind toward the Pharisees then. The chapter before this one relates their cold accusations of blasphemy against a blind man whom Jesus had healed. They hardly have the best interest of the flock in their hearts, while Jesus, who had removed the man's blindness, is a shepherd who tends to his sheep. So at one level, Jesus is contrasting himself with the Pharisees, and of course, the Pharisees come off rather poorly. But wait, as they say on TV, there's more. If the only authorized access to the sheepfold is through the gate, and the gate is Jesus himself, then membership in the flock is determined solely by one's relationship to the gatefolder, that is, to Christ. The only approved way to be part of the flock is through Jesus. Now, we live in a tolerant age, and this is an intolerant passage, at least in part. On the one hand, there are no preconditions as to which sheep can come and be part of the flock. If they enter through the gate, through Christ, then their membership in the flock is assured. They're not inspected on the way. On the other hand, there is no way to be a rightful part of the flock except through Jesus. Sheep who try to jump over the fence may get into the sheepfold, but they don't belong there, and they're merely impostors whom Jesus does not include in his flock. Now, there are some stunning implications for church membership here. It is easy to become a member of a church. To get one's name listed on a membership roll is not difficult. But this passage constrains us from thinking that having our name on a membership roll is the same thing as being part of Jesus' flock. The act of joining a church does not guarantee salvation. For if joining is done by jumping the fence, so to speak, spiritually speaking, then it is simply religious pretension. The only thing that counts is one's relationship to the shepherd. Entrance into the eternal kingdom of God is granted by Christ and not by any other means. This is not a warm, fuzzy teaching. It's a smack upside the head. Whoever enters the sheepfold through Jesus is saved, but no one else can admit entrance, nor is anyone who enters another way saved. By Christ and by Christ alone is our eternal place in the pasture both granted and guaranteed. Jesus is at one time the entryway into the eternal kingdom, and at the same time the true leader of the flock. The church's identity can only be determined by the identity of Christ. If Christ is the one who saves and leads, then we are the ones who are saved and are led. Followership is at least as important as leadership. We become members of Christ's flock by entering into relationship with God through Christ, in whom we receive abundant life. Most importantly, we are among those for whom Jesus laid down his life. By his death, Jesus paradoxically opened the gate to both an abundantly spirit-filled life in the here and now, and also to life in the eternal presence of God. So we really cannot understand ourselves as some of his sheep unless we keep foremost in mind that Jesus is our shepherd, and what does that actually mean? When we reflect on what and who we are supposed to be as the church, maybe we should ask ourselves whether we're being sheepish enough to be self-evidently identified as part of Jesus' flock. How do we make manifest our sheepish identity in the world? How do we as Christ's flock point the way to Christ as the shepherd, and not merely the shepherd for us alone, but for the whole world? Are our church committees sheepish? Do committee members try to displace Christ as the shepherd of the committee and its work, forcing forward personal agendas? or programs continued because, well, that's the way we've always done it. Most urgently, perhaps, we need always to remind ourselves of whose voice we are listening to. There are hundreds of different voices calling us, and it is easy for the shepherd's voice to be drowned out in all the noise. As Methodist author Robert Kohler wrote, there are different kinds of voices calling us to different kinds of work, and the problem is to find out which is the voice of God, rather than the voice of self-interest or cultural values or something else. All we are like sheep have gone astray, said Isaiah, and we are all doing our own private thing. We are called by the thieves and bandits of consumerism and selfishness and entertainment and inactivity, work, work, work. The list is endless. Do we still hear the shepherd's voice? And what does the shepherd call us to? Well, the scriptures tell us that. Let me just name a few. We are called to love one another. John 3:13 says, chapter 13 says, I give you a new commandment, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. You should also love one another. What are we called to? We're called from labor to rest. Matthew chapter 11, Jesus said, come to me all who are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Here's some other examples. We're called from death to life. 1 John chapter 3. We're called from bondage to liberty. Galatians chapter 5. We're called out of darkness into light. 1 Peter chapter 2. We're called from bondage to sin and the ways of the world into peace and rest with God. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We're called to the fellowship of the Son of God. 1 Corinthians chapter 1. And when we answer that call, here is what happens. We are made children of God. John chapter 1. We are made servants of God. Matthew chapter 25. We are made to be God's witnesses. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. We are made workers together with God. Co-workers with God. Sounds like a pretty good deal to me. 2 Corinthians chapter 6. We're called to a high calling. Philippians chapter 3. And to a holy calling. 2 Timothy chapter 1. These are merely some of the things that come to mind from this passage. But foremost and always, we really, really need to remember the only valid way into God's kingdom is through Christ. And to think we have a place in God's kingdom apart from going through Christ is very grievous self-deception. Only Christ is the shepherd, and the sheep must heed only Christ's call and follow where Christ leads. That is the way to life more abundant in the here and now and in eternity later. Let me just close with asking everyone to remember what Paul wrote in Galatians chapter 5. He said, you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love become servants for one another. That's our task. Let's live it out, at least in the coming week. God bless.